This is my ranking of action roguelike games that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash depending on how tight and responsive the combat feels, how rewarding the risk-reward progression is, and how well each run stays fresh through varied builds, upgrades, and enemy encounters. Let's get straight into the list. Returnal felt brutal at first because I kept dying quickly and struggled to react to the constant waves of bullets, lasers, and aggressive enemies attacking from every direction. After a few runs, the movement and combat started making much more sense, especially once I learned enemy patterns, weapon traits, and smarter ways to approach difficult encounters. I liked how every run forced me to adapt depending on the upgrades, parasites, and weapons I found along the way, which kept the gameplay fresh during longer sessions. The strange sci-fi atmosphere also added a lot, especially the creepy house sequences and mysterious story details slowly appearing between runs. Even with some lengthy attempts, the combat loop and replay value stayed strong enough to keep me returning without losing its momentum. This belongs in my masterpiece tier. Spiritfall mixes platform fighter mechanics with fast-paced roguelike combat, especially during the chaotic arena battles where enemies constantly fly across the screen. Combat stayed smooth and responsive, and I liked how every weapon changed the flow of each run, whether I was using heavy attacks with the hammer or moving quickly with faster weapons. The upgrade system kept runs interesting because there were always new abilities, elemental effects, and build combinations appearing during progression. I also enjoyed how positioning mattered during fights, since enemies could knock me around just as easily if I lost focus for a few seconds. The story and characters were pretty forgettable, though the addictive combat loop stayed strong across repeated runs and longer sessions. This easily lands in my excellent tier ranking. Dead Cells delivers fast movement, responsive combat, and a constant sense of progression across repeated runs. Every attempt felt different because the weapons, upgrades, enemy layouts, and routes kept changing, which made experimentation a huge part of the experience. I liked switching between aggressive melee builds, traps, ranged weapons, and faster movement-focused setups depending on what each run offered me. The movement also felt incredibly smooth, since dodging, climbing, rolling, and chaining attacks together happened at a quick pace without slowing the action down. Even failed runs rarely felt frustrating because there was almost always a new blueprint, upgrade, or shortcut waiting to be unlocked afterward. The pixel art style and atmosphere also gave the world a distinct personality that stayed memorable after many hours. This easily earns a spot in my masterpiece tier. Brotato delivers roguelike runs that constantly pushed me into experimenting with different weapons, upgrades, and stat combinations across every attempt. I liked how much freedom the build system offered, since every decision could change how the next few waves played out. Some runs focused on attack speed and range damage, while others turned into chaotic melee builds with explosive effects and turrets filling the screen. The combat stayed simple but satisfying because enemy waves kept getting more aggressive, forcing me to move carefully while managing groups attacking from every direction. I also liked how progression stayed fast, with new characters, weapons, and upgrades unlocking regularly without making the grind feel exhausting. Even though the game only uses a single arena, the build variety carried the experience across sessions. This easily lands in my excellent tier. Enter the Gungeon gave me some of the most chaotic and satisfying combat I have experienced in an action roguelike, especially during fights where bullets completely filled the screen from every direction. The dodge roll mechanics felt smooth, enemy patterns stayed challenging, and the huge variety of weapons made every run unpredictable in a fun way. I liked how one run could give me standard guns, while another suddenly handed me ridiculous weapons that completely changed how I approached combat. The pixel art style, fast pacing, and constant pressure during fights kept the gameplay exciting even after many failed attempts. Some runs could feel dependent on luck when weaker weapons appeared too often, though the combat mechanics and replay value stayed strong enough to keep me returning for more. This easily secures a place in my masterpiece tier. Wizard of Legend revolves around constantly chaining spells, dashes, and attacks together while dealing with aggressive enemies across every run. I liked how much freedom the magic system offered, since different spell combinations could completely change the flow of combat depending on the build I was using. Some setups focused on close-range combos, while others relied more on ranged attacks, movement, and elemental effects to control crowded rooms. The movement stayed smooth and responsive, which made difficult fights satisfying once I learned enemy patterns and better timing for dodges. I also enjoyed unlocking new spells and artifacts between runs because progression stayed rewarding without slowing the pace down too much. The environments could feel repetitive after longer sessions, though the combat system easily carried the experience forward. This earns a solid place in my excellent tier. Cult of the Lamb mixes action roguelike combat with base management in a way that kept both sides of the gameplay interesting during most of my time with it. I enjoyed returning from dungeon runs to build new structures, manage followers, unlock upgrades, and slowly expand the cult between battles. The combat stayed simple but satisfying, especially during faster fights, where dodging attacks and clearing crowded rooms became more intense later in the game. I also liked the art style and soundtrack, since the cute visuals mixed surprisingly well with the darker themes and strange creature designs. Some weapons and upgrades felt much stronger than others, and the combat depth did not stay as strong during longer sessions compared to other roguelikes I played. The unique mix of gameplay systems easily places this in my great tier. Children of Morta combines roguelike dungeon crawling with a strong family-focused story that gave the experience much more personality than I expected. I liked how each family member played differently, since switching between ranged attacks, melee combat, and faster characters changed the rhythm of every run. The combat itself stayed simple but satisfying, especially once new abilities and upgrades started opening more build options during longer sessions. I also enjoyed returning home after difficult runs, because the story scenes and family interactions made progression feel more meaningful between battles. Some sections required extra grinding before I could handle tougher bosses, though the steady upgrades and character variety kept the gameplay rewarding during repeated attempts. The pixel art, music, and emotional storytelling helped this game stand apart from many other roguelikes I have played. This belongs in my excellent tier. The Binding of Isaac became more interesting with every run once different items, upgrades, and strange power combinations started stacking together. I liked how the random generation kept each attempt feeling fresh, since weapons, enemies, bosses, and room layouts were always changing in unexpected ways. The combat stayed simple at first, though the deeper mechanics slowly became more satisfying once I learned enemy patterns, secret rooms, and stronger build combinations across repeated runs. The dark art style and disturbing themes also gave the game a unique identity that made it stand apart from most other roguelikes I have played. Some item combinations could completely break the balance of a run, but that unpredictability became part of what made the experience so entertaining after many hours. This easily secures a place in my masterpiece tier. TMNT Splintered Fate uses a structure similar to Hades, though the fast combat and different turtle abilities still made the gameplay enjoyable across repeated runs. I liked switching between the turtles because each one handled combat differently, whether I wanted faster attacks, stronger defense, or more aggressive close-range damage. The upgrade system also kept runs interesting, since elemental effects, passive boosts, and different abilities could completely change how each attempt played out. Boss fights became surprisingly difficult later in the game, especially during modified challenge encounters where enemy pressure increased a lot. I also enjoyed the comic-inspired art style and hearing familiar characters throughout the adventure, which helped the world feel authentic to the TMNT universe. Some enemy variety and technical issues held it back slightly, though this still earns a place in my great tier. Soulstone Survivors surrounds me with huge enemy waves while rewarding progression through upgrades, abilities, and new character builds during every run. I liked how quickly weak characters could turn into completely overpowered builds once stronger skills, elemental effects, and weapon combinations started stacking together. The large character roster also helped keep runs fresh, since different classes encouraged different playstyles depending on the abilities I wanted to focus on. Combat became chaotic later in runs, with the entire screen filling with attacks, explosions, and enemy hordes, though the gameplay still stayed smooth during the chaos. I also enjoyed how fast unlocks happened, because there always seemed to be another upgrade, skill tree bonus, or new class waiting afterward. The grind could become repetitive during longer sessions, though the addictive progression loop still places this in my great tier. Shape of Dreams had some interesting ideas with its colorful art style, fast combat, and large variety of abilities, but too many frustrating systems kept ruining the experience during my runs. I liked experimenting with different memories, augments, and builds because the combat could become pretty chaotic and visually impressive once everything started working together. The problem was that movement through menus, maps, and upgrades felt clunky, especially while using a controller, which made progression more annoying than rewarding after a while. Solo runs also felt poorly balanced later on, since stronger enemies and hunter encounters could end attempts far too quickly without giving much room to recover. There were moments where the combat became enjoyable, though the frustrating mechanics and uneven balance still leave this sitting in my trash tier. Ember Knights focuses heavily on fast combat, quick dodges, and aggressive enemy encounters that become more challenging during longer runs. I liked how responsive the movement and attacks felt, because every successful dodge into a counterattack made fights satisfying without slowing the pace down. The relic and skill system also added a good amount of variety, since different combinations could completely change how I approached bosses in crowded rooms. I enjoyed unlocking permanent upgrades between runs as well, because progression stayed steady without making early attempts feel pointless. The pixel art style and colorful environments also helped the game stay visually appealing across repeated sessions. Multiplayer added extra fun during chaotic fights, though I still enjoyed most of my time playing solo and experimenting with different builds. This easily settles into my great tier. Ravenswatch has fast combat, strong character variety, and a dark fantasy style that made every run visually interesting from beginning to end. I liked how differently each hero played, since switching characters completely changed the pacing, abilities, and combat strategy during runs. Some characters focused on ranged attacks, while others relied more on close combat, movement, or crowd control abilities against larger enemy groups. The time limit during each run also added pressure, because I constantly had to balance exploration, upgrades, side objectives, and tougher encounters before reaching the boss. I also enjoyed how smooth the combat felt during chaotic fights, especially when abilities, enemies, and effects completely filled the screen. Solo play could become frustrating during harder sections, since survival felt less balanced alone, though the gameplay variety still places this in my great tier. The Rogue Prince of Persia makes movement the strongest part of the experience, with fast parkour mechanics, wall running, climbing, and smooth platforming across every run. I liked how quickly traversal opened up once I started chaining jumps, wall hops, and movement abilities together, because it made navigating levels genuinely satisfying. The roguelike structure also worked well, since unlocking new paths, upgrades, and areas gradually expanded future runs without making progression feel repetitive. Combat stayed enjoyable too, especially during faster encounters where movement became just as important as attacking enemies directly. I also liked the colorful art style and fluid animations, because they helped the game stay visually appealing during chaotic fights and platforming sections. The story never became particularly interesting, and some combat mechanics felt standard compared to the movement system. This earns a place in my excellent tier. Roboquest focuses on fast movement, chaotic shooting, and aggressive enemy encounters that barely give you time to slow down during runs. I liked how the combat rewarded constant movement, because standing still for even a few seconds usually turned into a disaster once enemies started surrounding me from every direction. The weapon variety also kept runs interesting, since every attempt could suddenly hand me rocket launchers, bows, shotguns, or strange weapons that completely changed how combat played out. I also enjoyed the smooth movement and colorful art style because the gameplay stayed visually clean even during chaotic fights filled with explosions and projectiles. Progression between runs felt rewarding too, since new upgrades, weapons, and shortcuts slowly expanded future attempts without removing the challenge completely. This easily earns a place in my excellent tier. Gunfire Reborn focuses on fast first-person shooting and a huge variety of weapons that kept runs entertaining across many hours. I liked how different heroes completely changed the gameplay, since some focused on elemental damage, defensive abilities, or aggressive close-range builds depending on the character I picked. The weapon system also added a lot of replay value because random modifiers and upgrades could turn ordinary guns into ridiculously strong builds later in a run. Combat stayed satisfying thanks to the quick movement, constant enemy pressure, and creative weapons that ranged from standard rifles to strange energy-based attacks. I also enjoyed unlocking permanent upgrades because progression stayed rewarding even after failed attempts. The environments could become repetitive during longer sessions, though the build variety and gunplay still place this in my excellent tier. Deadzone Rogue has fast first-person combat, a strong weapon system, and enough upgrades to keep runs entertaining across repeated attempts. I liked how every room started with a short stealth phase because it gave me time to plan fights before everything turned chaotic. The weapon variety also helped a lot since assault rifles, shotguns, SMGs, and strange energy weapons could completely change how each run played out. I also enjoyed stacking augments, perks, and passive bonuses because stronger builds eventually turned combat into complete chaos against larger enemy groups. The progression system stayed rewarding too, since there were always more upgrades, unlocks, and challenges waiting after failed runs. Some environments started feeling repetitive after longer sessions, and a few technical issues interrupted the flow during combat. The gunplay and progression systems place this in my good tier. Hades 2 improves on almost everything I liked about the first game with deeper combat, stronger progression systems, and an incredible amount of variety across repeated runs. I liked how every weapon completely changed the flow of combat since some focused on fast attacks while others relied more on heavy damage, magic abilities, or stronger positioning. The new Omega attacks also added more strategy, because timing stronger abilities properly could completely turn difficult fights around. I also enjoyed how rewards, upgrades, and new story moments kept appearing regularly, which made failed runs feel rewarding instead of frustrating. The character writing, music, and visual design stayed consistently strong as well, especially during boss fights where the presentation became even more memorable. Very few roguelikes managed to stay this engaging after dozens of runs. This easily belongs in my masterpiece tier. Curse of the Dead Gods focuses on slower, more methodical combat, where every dodge, parry, and attack timing matters during fights. I liked how the stamina system forced me to think carefully instead of button mashing because reckless mistakes were punished almost immediately. The corruption mechanic also added extra tension, since stronger rewards often came with dangerous drawbacks that could completely ruin a run later on. I enjoyed how traps, darkness, and environmental hazards became part of combat too, especially during tougher encounters where positioning mattered a lot. The weapon variety kept runs interesting, and learning how different combinations worked together made progression more rewarding over time. Some upgrade systems felt grindy early on, and the build variety never became as wild as other roguelikes I played. The combat depth and satisfying challenge easily place this in my excellent tier. BlazBlue Entropy Effect has fast 2D combat, smooth movement, and enough character variety to keep runs entertaining across repeated sessions. I liked how differently each fighter played because switching characters completely changed the pacing, attack style, and strategy during combat encounters. Some characters focused on speed and ranged attacks, while others relied more on slower hits, stronger defense, or aggressive close-range pressure. The upgrade system also added plenty of build variety, since combining abilities, elemental effects, and passive bonuses could drastically change how each run developed. I also enjoyed how fluid the movement and animations felt because combat stayed satisfying even during larger fights filled with enemies and visual effects. The story sections never became very interesting, and repeated voice lines started getting annoying after longer sessions. The combat and progression systems easily place this in my excellent tier. Astral Ascent has incredibly smooth 2D combat, fast movement, and a huge amount of build variety that kept runs entertaining for hours. I liked how spells, upgrades, and gambits could completely change combat because combining different effects often created chaotic and powerful attack setups during longer runs. The movement also felt excellent since dodging attacks, chaining abilities, and reacting during boss fights stayed responsive throughout the entire experience. I enjoyed how every character played differently too, with unique weapons, spells, and mechanics that changed the pacing of combat depending on who I selected. The boss fights became one of my favorite parts because learning attack patterns and surviving difficult encounters felt genuinely rewarding after repeated attempts. The hub area could feel slightly confusing at times, though the combat systems and progression easily place this in my excellent tier. Moonlighter combines dungeon crawling with shop management in a way that made the progression loop surprisingly addictive during my time with it. I liked returning from dungeon runs to organize loot, set prices, and slowly improve the shop because it gave the game a different pace compared to most roguelikes I have played. The dungeon exploration also stayed enjoyable since finding rare items and deciding what to keep or sell added extra tension during runs. I also liked how inventory management became part of the strategy because certain items had special effects that forced me to organize my bag carefully. The pixel art style and music gave the world a relaxing atmosphere even when the dungeons became more dangerous later on. Combat sometimes felt a little clunky during tougher fights, though the gameplay loop places this in my great tier. Skul the Hero Slayer has fast combat, strong build variety, and a huge selection of skulls that completely change how every run plays out. I liked experimenting with different skull combinations because switching between speed, power, and balanced builds made combat feel fresh across repeated attempts. Some skulls focused on quick attacks and movement, while others relied more on heavy damage, elemental abilities, or large area attacks against enemy groups. The combat also stayed satisfying since attacks felt impactful and chaotic, once stronger upgrades and equipment started stacking together during longer runs. I enjoyed seeing how different weapons and skulls completely changed Skul's appearance too, which added extra personality to progression. Some enemies could feel overly tanky, and crowded fights occasionally became messy to read during intense moments. The variety and combat systems place this in my great tier. Risk of Rain 2 starts simple, but slowly turns into complete chaos, once enemies, upgrades, and effects begin stacking together during runs. I liked how every item permanently added something to my build, because combining attack speed, healing, elemental damage, and movement bonuses could create ridiculously overpowered setups later on. The timer system also added pressure since enemies kept getting stronger the longer I spent exploring each area. I enjoyed learning different survivors too because every character completely changed how combat and movement worked depending on their abilities. The soundtrack and atmosphere also stood out since quiet exploration could suddenly shift into massive fights filled with non-stop attacks and explosions everywhere on screen. Longer runs could become exhausting because the intensity rarely slowed down much. The progression, build variety, and chaotic gameplay place this in my masterpiece tier. That's my full ranking of action roguelike games based on combat feel, build variety, and how each run holds up over time. Some shine through pure mechanical depth and replayability, while others stand out through speed, chaos, or creative progression systems. Thanks for watching.